Pamela Smart. She sat in the front pew at her husband's funeral, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, the very portrait of a young wife undone by grief. Cameras followed her, neighbors consoled her, and she played the role so completely that not a single person standing in that church that day could have imagined the truth, that the woman weeping loudest was the same woman who had set the whole thing in motion. There is a specific kind of cold that does not come from weather. It comes from a person who can plan a man's end and then cry at his burial. Pamela Smart was that kind of cold. Pamela Ann Woyas was born on August 16, 1967, in Coral Gables, Florida. She grew up in Miami before her family relocated to Derry, New Hampshire during her middle school years. By most accounts, she was sharp, driven, and keenly image-conscious. She attended Pinkerton Academy and later went on to college, eventually landing a role as a media services coordinator at School Administrative Unit 21 in Hampton, New Hampshire. She had a new husband, a career in education, and all the trappings of a life that looked, from the outside, like it was going exactly according to plan. The question no one thought to ask was, whose plan exactly? Gregory Smart was 24 years old, working in insurance, and had recently married Pamela. By all accounts, theirs was a union that had already begun to show cracks. Pamela would later claim that Greg had been unfaithful, that her self-esteem had crumbled, and that she had felt lost. Whether or not that is entirely true, what followed those feelings was a decision that would alter the lives of everyone around her and end the life of one man who never saw it coming. Somewhere between lesson planning and staff meetings, Pamela began an affair with William Flynn, a 15-year-old student she had met through a school program. Flynn was young, impressionable, and completely taken with her. What prosecutors would later argue, and what evidence strongly supported, was that Pamela used that devotion as a tool. She allegedly told Flynn that she could not leave her husband because a divorce would cost her everything, including a condominium the couple shared and a $140,000 life insurance policy. According to Flynn's own testimony, she made the arrangement plain. If he truly loved her, he would prove it, and if he did not, she would end the relationship. On the evening of May 1, 1990, Pamela attended a school board meeting, carefully establishing her alibi. While she was there, Flynn and his friend Patrick Randall entered the couple's condominium in Derry. When Greg Smart arrived home that night, he was forced to his knees. He begged for his life. Flynn fired a single shot. Greg Smart, 24 years old, was gone. The teenagers staged the scene to resemble a burglary and slipped away into the dark. Pamela arrived home later that evening to find her husband's body. What followed were weeks of media appearances in which she portrayed herself as a shattered widow desperately seeking justice. She gave interviews. She cooperated with investigators. She was articulate, composed, and convincing. But behind the scenes, she was working to keep her secret intact. The unraveling began when Cecilia Pierce, a teenage intern who worked closely with Pamela, went to police. Pierce had known about the plot all along, and after Greg's death, Pamela had allegedly pressured her to stay silent. In July of 1990, Pierce agreed to wear a recording device during conversations with Pamela. On that recording, Pamela's voice could be heard warning Pierce in no uncertain terms about what would happen if she told the truth. She spoke about prison. She spoke about consequences. The mask slipped entirely. Pamela Smart was arrested on August 1, 1990. Her trial, which began on March 4, 1991, became something the American public had never witnessed before. It was the first murder trial in United States history to be broadcast live on television, gavel to gavel. A local New Hampshire station preempted its daytime programming to carry it. Roughly 150 journalists from across the world crowded around the courthouse. Flynn took the stand, wept openly, and testified that he never would have gone through with it if it had not been for Pamela. Randall testified. Ladime testified. Each of them had already entered plea arrangements, and each of them pointed the same direction. Pamela herself took the stand for 2 days of cross-examination. She was composed, almost eerily so, acknowledging the affair, but denying any foreknowledge of or involvement in the murder. The The jury deliberated and returned its verdict on March 22, 1991, guilty on all 3 counts: accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering. Under New Hampshire law, the accomplice charge carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 23 years old. Flynn, who pulled the trigger, was eventually released in 2015 after serving a 25-year sentence. The other accomplices were also released over the years. Pamela Smart remains incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in Westchester County, New York, where she has now spent more than 3 decades. In June of 2024, she finally acknowledged responsibility for the first time, something she had refused to do for over 30 years. Greg Smart's family noted that she did not once mention his name in her statement. Some people spend a lifetime building a reputation. Greg Smart spent his entire life never knowing the one person he trusted most had decided his life was worth less than a real estate arrangement. That is the truth that has sat at the center of this case for more than 30 years, and no amount of televised trials, Hollywood films, or prison petitions has ever changed it.
Lisa Ann Coleman. There's a question that sits at the edge of every child abuse case that ends in tragedy, and it never gets easier to answer. Where were the people who were supposed to step in? Devonte Williams had been seen. His family had been investigated. Files had been opened and opened again. The system had circled his name more than half a dozen times over the course of his short life. And yet, on the morning of July 26, 2004, paramedics arrived at an Arlington, Texas apartment to find a 9-year-old boy lying on the bathroom floor, wearing only a diaper and bandages, already gone for hours. He weighed 35 pounds. He looked, to the first responder who found him, like a child no older than 3 or 4. His name was Devonte Marcel Williams, and the woman at the center of his story was Lisa Ann Coleman. Coleman was born on October 6, 1975 in Tarrant County, Texas. Her early life carried a weight that few people are ever asked to carry. She was conceived through an act of violence, raised in foster homes, cycled through a system that failed to protect her, just as it would later fail to protect Devonte. Relatives who should have been a source of safety were the opposite. She was beaten. She was introduced to drugs and alcohol by family members as a teenager. She left school after the 10th grade and had a child of her own at 16. By the time she was a young adult, she had already served 2 prison terms, once for burglary, once for drug possession. The details of her upbringing are not offered here to excuse what came later, but they are offered because they are true, and because understanding what shaped a person is the only honest way to look at what that person eventually becomes. Marcella Williams was the mother of Devonte, and she and Coleman had been in a relationship for years. The 2 women shared an apartment in Arlington. Devonte, born prematurely in June of 1995, had developmental challenges from an early age. Child Protective Services had already investigated Marcella's household 7 times, beginning in 1995 when the boy was just 2 months old. In 1999, after CPS found evidence of physical abuse, both Devonte and his younger sister were removed from the home and placed in foster care. The agency's own records identified Coleman as the source of that abuse. Marcella Williams regained custody after 1 year on the condition that she stay away from Coleman. She did not stay away. By 2002, Coleman and Marcella had resumed their relationship, and with that reunion came a quiet but determined effort to keep Devonte out of sight. The 2 women stopped sending him to school. They told school officials they had moved out of the district. They turned away visitors. Prosecutors would later argue that these actions, isolating a child from the outside world, restricting his movement, cutting him off from anyone who might notice his condition, constituted kidnapping under Texas law. That legal argument would become the foundation of a capital murder charge that would ultimately send Coleman to death row. On that July morning in 2004, when paramedics arrived and found Devonte's body, the medical examiner determined the cause of death to be severe malnutrition resulting in pneumonia. The boy had more than 250 documented injuries. His 8-year-old sister, Destiny, took the stand at trial and described what life had looked like inside that apartment. She testified that Coleman bound Devonte with an extension cord in the bathroom. She testified that Coleman used belts, hangers, and extension cords on both her and her siblings. Forensic evidence placed Coleman's DNA on a golf club found in the apartment. Devonte's DNA was found on the same club. The testimony painted a picture of a household where punishment had become something else entirely, something sustained, something with a direction. Coleman's defense team argued that Devonte's death was accidental, that the boy's behavioral challenges had overwhelmed two women who were unprepared to parent him, and that his condition resulted from a failure of judgment rather than deliberate intent. They asked the jury to consider Coleman's own history of abuse, her bipolar disorder diagnosis, and the deeply damaged circumstances that had followed her since childhood. Even Coleman's own expert witness acknowledged under cross-examination that Devonte had experienced prolonged suffering. The jury deliberated for just under an hour before returning a guilty verdict on June 22, 2006. Coleman was sentenced to death. Marcella Williams, who had entered a guilty plea in exchange for avoiding capital charges, received a life sentence. For 8 years, Coleman's attorneys filed appeals, arguing that the kidnapping charge was legally flawed and that her race and sexual orientation had influenced the state's decision to pursue the death penalty. Every appeal was denied. The United States Supreme Court declines to intervene. On September 17, 2014, Lisa Ann Coleman was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She was 38 years old. She died 12 minutes after the drug was administered, having spoken final words of love to her family and to the women she had come to know on death row. She became the 6th woman executed in Texas since 1982, and only the 15th woman put to death in the United States since capital punishment was reinstated in 1976. Devonte Williams never reached his 10th birthday. The CPS investigations that bore his name outlasted him, and in the years that followed, the circumstances of his death became part of a broader reckoning in Texas about how the state's child welfare system handled the most exposed children in its care.
Natasha Cornett. A 6-year-old girl named Tabitha offered chocolates to the people who were about to take her life. Let that sit for a moment. Not fear, not tears, chocolates. That single detail, innocent, heartbreaking, almost impossible to process, is perhaps the most telling window into everything that happened on that gravel road in Baileyton, Tennessee on April 6, 1997. It tells you everything about who the victims were, and by contrast, everything about the darkness that had consumed the woman who led the group that ended their lives. Her name was Natasha Wallen Cornett, and long before she became the face of one of the most disturbing crimes in East Tennessee history, she was a girl that the world had largely given up on. Born on January 26, 1979, Natasha came into the world already carrying a weight most children never know. Her mother, Madonna Wallen, had been involved in an affair with a local policeman named Roger Burgess, and Natasha was the result. When Natasha was still a toddler, her mother left her husband and raised Natasha alone in a rundown trailer on the outskirts of Pikeville, Kentucky. Poverty was not a visitor in that household. It was a permanent resident. Stability was something other families had. Love, at least in the forms a child can understand and hold on to, was in short supply. By her early teenage years, Natasha had begun cutting herself, abusing alcohol and drugs, and retreating into a subculture that reflected the internal devastation she could not put into words. She embraced the goth aesthetic, the black clothing, the dark music, the occult. She married young, and when that marriage ended, she carried its wreckage with her. What she could do, though, was draw people in. Young people who were similarly lost, similarly wounded, similarly furious at a world that had seemed to offer them nothing, were drawn into her orbit. She became the informal center of gravity for a group of 6 disaffected youths in Pikeville, young people who, like her, were drowning quietly and looking for any way out. On April 6, 1997, that way out took the form of a road trip. Natasha, then 18 years old, climbed into a beat-up Chevrolet Citation with 5 companions: Edward Dean Mullins, age 19, Joseph Lance Risner, age 20, Crystal R. Sturgill, age 18, Karen R. Howell, age 17, and Jason Blake Bryant, just 14 years old. The destination was New Orleans, Louisiana, a city that existed in their imaginations as somewhere life might finally be different. Before leaving, they had obtained 2 firearms, a 9mm handgun and a .25 caliber pistol. They had also already discussed, among themselves, the possibility of stealing a more reliable vehicle along the way because Risner's Citation was unlikely to survive the journey. They never made it to New Orleans.
At an interstate rest stop near Greenville, Tennessee, their path crossed with the Lillelid family. Vidar Lillelid, 34, was a Norwegian-born man of deep faith. His wife Delphina, 28, was Honduran-American. Their daughter Tabitha was 6 years old. Their son Peter was just 2. The family was returning home from a Jehovah's Witness convention in Johnson City. Vidar, ever the devoted witness to his faith, walked over to the group of young people and struck up a conversation, hoping, as was his nature, to share what he believed. What happened next unfolded with a speed and finality that no one in that family could have seen coming. The group forced the Lillelids at gunpoint back into their van and ordered Vidar to drive to a remote, deserted road outside Baileyton. It was there, on that gravel road, that the family was made to exit the vehicle. Court testimony would later establish that 14-year-old Jason Bryant fired the shots, though exactly which other members of the group participated remains a subject of differing accounts. Vidar and Delphina were shot and died at the scene. 6-year-old Tabitha, the little girl who had offered chocolates to her captors during the drive, died on the way to the hospital. 2-year-old Peter survived, though he carried the physical wounds of that day with him. The group abandoned their citation and fled in the Lillelids' stolen van, abandoning their New Orleans plan and now aiming for Mexico instead. They never got there. 2 days later, having crossed into Mexico without proper documentation, they were turned back by Mexican authorities and detained by U.S. Customs and Immigration officials in Arizona. All 6 were transported to Greenville, Tennessee, and booked on charges of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and kidnapping. In a move to avoid the possibility of the death penalty, Natasha Cornett pleaded guilty to all charges. On March 25, 1998, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 19 years old when the judge handed down that sentence, the same age, roughly, as the people she had led on that catastrophic road trip. Forensic psychologist Helen Smith, in her book The Scarred Heart, Understanding and Identifying Kids Who Kill, used Natasha Cornett's story as a case study, not to excuse what she did, but to examine what years of failed systems look like when they collide. Failed schools, failed mental health interventions, a criminal justice system that encountered her and moved on. By the time the world truly looked at Natasha Cornett, it was already too late for a family of 4 on a Tennessee highway. Today, Natasha Cornett remains incarcerated at the Bledsoe County Correctional Complex in Pikeville, Tennessee, less than 100 miles, in a strange and painful irony, from where her story began. She is 46 years old. She will spend the rest of her life behind those walls. 3 members of the Lillelid family will never grow older than the ages they were on that April day in 1997. And little Peter, the toddler who survived, carries forward into life a story no child should ever have to carry. Tiffany Nicole Moss. Most people, when they sit in a courtroom and face the possibility of spending the rest of their lives behind bars, or worse, fight. They hire lawyers, they craft narratives, they appeal to the mercy of the jury, they do something. Tiffany Nicole Moss did none of that. She sat through her own capital murder trial in Gwinnett County, Georgia, representing herself, asking not a single question of the witnesses who testified against her, offering no opening statement, no closing argument, and no words of any kind to the 12 people who held her fate. She stared straight ahead,
She said almost nothing, and when the death sentence was read aloud in that courtroom on May 1, 2019, her face did not change. The silence of Tiffany Moss was, in its own way, the most disturbing thing about a case that had no shortage of disturbing details. Tiffany Nicole Moss was born on July 20, 1983. As a young adult, she worked as a preschool teacher, a profession built on patience, care, and attentiveness to children. She met Imam Giovanni Moss at the Freedom Christian Church in Gwinnett County, where he had been bringing his young daughter, Imani, to services. Imani Gabrielle Moss had been born on April 23, 2003. Her biological mother, struggling with addiction, had surrendered parental rights shortly after Imani's birth, and Iman had raised her largely on his own. Tiffany and Iman married in July of 2009 and went on to have 2 children together. For a brief window, it may have looked like a family finding its footing. But there were signs even early on that something was deeply wrong in how Tiffany treated Imani, and only Imani. In March of 2010, when Imani was 6 years old, a school nurse noticed something that could not be explained away. The child expressed fear about going home with a bad report card. The nurse looked closer and found marks on Imani's arms, back, chest, legs, and shoulders. Tiffany was arrested, charged with first-degree child cruelty, and ultimately pleaded guilty under Georgia's first offender program, receiving 5 years of probation. She lost her teaching job. Imani was placed temporarily with her grandmother, Robin, and during those months her school performance improved noticeably. Then the courts returned her to her father's home, and Robin's fears, which she had voiced clearly to every authority who would listen, were set aside.
What happened over the following years unfolded slowly and almost entirely out of public view. Iman worked 2 jobs, leaving early in the morning and not returning until late at night. That left Tiffany in charge of the children for most of each day. Imani's extended family last saw her on Mother's Day of 2013. After that, she effectively disappeared from the world. No school, no church visits, no neighbors who recalled seeing her outside. By the late summer of 2013, the family had moved to an apartment in Lawrenceville, Georgia, and prosecutors would later state that it was around this time that Tiffany began withholding food from Imani in a sustained and deliberate way. The child was confined to her bedroom. Her father's long absences meant that no one who might have intervened was present for what was taking place. On October 24, 2013, Iman noticed that Imani appeared to be having a seizure. Tiffany told him something was wrong with the child. Imani was moved to her bed and remained there for 4 days, unable to eat, unable to move. She died on October 28, 2013. She was 10 years old and weighed 32 pounds, the average weight of a child between 2 and 3 years of age. Rather than call for help, Tiffany and Iman initially planned to report Imani as a runaway. They attempted to dispose of her body in a galvanized steel trash can outside the apartment building. Iman eventually called police. When investigators arrived and saw what was in that trash can, and when the medical examiner's report came back confirming that the cause of death was severe malnutrition, the full weight of what had happened became impossible to dismiss. Tiffany was charged with malice murder, cruelty to children in the first degree, and concealing the death of another. Iman pleaded guilty in 2015 and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Tiffany's trial began in April of 2019. She waived her right to counsel and chose to represent herself, a decision that legal observers found deeply puzzling given the stakes. She questioned none of the prosecution's witnesses. She offered no alternative account of events. When the judge required her to speak, she occasionally laughed. When her husband took the stand and testified against her, she tracked him with her eyes as he left the courtroom. That was one of only 2 visible emotional responses she showed during the entire proceeding. The other came when prosecutors introduced the trash can into evidence. She looked away. The jury deliberated for approximately 2.5 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. On May 1, 2019, Tiffany Nicole Moss was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She became the only woman on death row in the state of Georgia and is currently incarcerated at Arrendale State Prison. The Georgia Capitol defenders have sought a new trial, arguing in part that she was not competent to represent herself.
As of this writing, those appeals remain ongoing. Imani Moss never made it to her 11th birthday. The Georgia Division of Family and Children Services later undertook a review of how her case had been handled over the years, the reports, the investigations, the decisions that returned her to a home where she was not safe. Her story became part of a larger reckoning about child welfare oversight in the state. But reckonings, however necessary, arrived too late for the children whose names make them necessary. Imani's name is one of those.
Heather Keaton. There is a version of this story that almost no one knows, and it begins not with a crime, but with a college campus. Somewhere between the lecture halls and the scholarship paperwork, between the aspirations of a young woman who was legally blind and yet still determined to earn a degree at Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama, there was a life that could have gone somewhere entirely different. That is perhaps the most disquieting thing about Heather Lavelle Keaton. Not the outcome, but the distance between who she could have been and what she chose to become. What turns a scholarship student, a young woman celebrated for overcoming her severe visual impairment, into one of the most reviled figures in the history of Alabama's courts? What happens inside a person when cruelty quietly replaces compassion, not in a single explosion of rage, but in a slow, deliberate accumulation of choices? These are the questions that linger long after the courtroom doors close, long after the verdict is read. Heather Lavelle Keaton was born in 1988. By the time she entered her early 20s, she had entered a common-law marriage with a man named John DeBlaze, who had 2 young children from a previous relationship. A little girl named Natalie, born on November 4, 2005, and a little boy named Chase, born on December 29, 2006. Their biological mother, Corinne Heathcock, had relinquished custody to DeBlaze, whom she described as a devoted and caring father. At the time she signed over those children, she had every reason to believe they were safe. They were not. What followed throughout 2009 and into 2010 was a pattern of mistreatment directed at Natalie and Chase that multiple witnesses observed and in some cases reported. At a cookout attended by neighbors and friends, Lavelle Keaton was seen screaming at the children and grabbing Natalie roughly enough that another adult stepped between them and issued a direct warning. That warning changed nothing. Behind closed doors, though the phrase itself is now too mild for what transpired, the 2 children were subjected to a prolonged period of deprivation and cruelty that prosecutors would later describe as a cascade of overlapping harms: starvation, dehydration, restraint, and psychological terror. Court documents describe occasions where Chase was restrained with tape and left standing in a corner through the night, a sock in his mouth, while the adults in the house went to bed. On March 4, 2010, 4-year-old Natalie died. John DeBlaze disposed of her remains in a wooded area outside Citronelle, Alabama. On June 20th of the same year, 3-year-old Chase died. His remains were left in a remote, heavily wooded stretch of land near Van Cleve, Mississippi. Both children's bodies would not be found until December of 2010, when a family member of Lavelle Keaton approached law enforcement with the fear that the children might be dead. By then, Natalie and Chase had been gone for months, their absence apparently unremarkable to the adults responsible for them. When police located the skeletal remains of both children, all that was left of Natalie were 68 bones and 3 teeth. Chase's remains amounted to 21 bones and 2 teeth. A medical examiner who later performed autopsies testified that she could not make a definitive ruling on the cause of death, but identified a range of likely contributing factors, including poisoning, starvation, dehydration, and the deprivation of air. A bottle of antifreeze was recovered from DeBlaze's van during a subsequent search. Both DeBlaze and Lavelle Keaton were arrested in December 2010. Each pointed at the other. That mutual deflection of responsibility, a choreography of blame, would come to define much of the legal proceedings that followed. John DeBlaze went to trial first in October 2014. Confession letters he had written were entered into evidence, in which he admitted to being directly involved in the children's deaths. He was convicted and sentenced to death.
Heather Lavelle Keaton's trial began on May 8, 2015. The jury returned their verdict on May 27th, finding her guilty of capital murder in the death of Chase and reckless manslaughter in the death of Natalie. The distinction in those two charges struck many legal observers as unusual, given that the same household and the same sustained period of neglect produced both deaths. Nonetheless, on the capital murder conviction, the sentence was unambiguous. Heather Lavelle Keaton became the first woman in Mobile County history to be sent to Alabama's death row. She was 27 years old. The years since have been marked by an unbroken chain of legal challenges. The Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals ordered a new sentencing hearing in 2020 on the grounds that she had not been permitted to address the court before her original sentence was imposed. That resentencing hearing took place in January 2021, and the result was identical: death. She appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court, which declined to review the case in 2022. She then appealed to the United States Supreme Court, which rejected her petition on June 5, 2023, without comment. As of today, Heather Lavelle Keaton remains on death row at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama. She is 37 years old. Natalie was 4. Chase was 3. Neither of them ever got to be anything else.
Antoinette Frank. Imagine that the person sent to protect you, the one wearing the uniform, carrying the badge, sworn before a court and a community to serve and defend, is the same person who becomes the source of your greatest danger. Not a stranger in the dark, not a nameless face, but someone who knew your name, ate at your table, accepted your birthday gifts, and smiled at your family across the counter of your restaurant. That is the specific kind of collapse of trust at the heart of the Antoinette Frank case, and it is what makes her story, nearly 3 decades later, still so difficult to fully absorb. Antoinette Renee Frank was born on April 30, 1971, in New Orleans, Louisiana. Her childhood, by most accounts, was marked by instability and harm at home. She later claimed to have endured years of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse at the hands of her father, Adam Frank, claims that only surfaced publicly during her appeals process, long after her conviction. A psychiatrist who examined her in 1995 and again in 1999 concluded that she showed signs of narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features. The picture that emerged of her early life was not one of a person who had been prepared by her circumstances to exercise restraint or sound judgment, but it was also not one that explained everything that came later. Frank applied to the New Orleans Police Department in early 1993. Her application raised red flags from the start. She failed 2 psychiatric evaluations. Portions of her application contained falsehoods. Despite all of this, the NOPD, then operating under enormous pressure to diversify its ranks amid a citywide crime crisis, hired her anyway. She graduated from the police academy in February of 1993 and was assigned to the 7th District. New Orleans at the time was, by several national measures, the most dangerous city in the United States. The department was losing officers faster than it could replace them. Standards that should have been firm were being quietly set aside. Antoinette Frank was, in more than one sense, a product of that environment. It was through the department that she came to know Officer Ronald A. Williams II. Williams was described by colleagues as a devoted, well-regarded officer, married with 2 children, and committed to the work. He and Frank were assigned to the same platoon, worked the same shift, and were eventually paired for off-duty security detail at the Kim On restaurant, a family-owned Vietnamese establishment on Bullard Avenue in eastern New Orleans, run by the Vu family. Over time, Frank became close with the family. Chow Vu, one of the adult children, would later tell investigators that Frank had seemed warm and trustworthy. When it was Frank's birthday, the Vus gave her presents. When she was short on money, they helped her out. She was, in their understanding, someone they could rely on. In late February of 1995, Frank began bringing a young man named Rogers Lacaze to the restaurant. Lacaze was 18 years old, had already accumulated a history of drug dealing and involvement in violent incidents, and had first come to Frank's attention months earlier during a street altercation she had responded to as an officer. She introduced him to the Vu family as her nephew.
Investigators would later conclude that Frank and Lacaze had a personal relationship and that the two had discussed the restaurant's layout, its cash, and its hours. In the early hours of Saturday, March 4, 1995, Ronald Williams was working an off-duty security shift at the Kim On. Frank and Lacaze entered the restaurant. What followed left 3 people dead. Williams was shot and killed. Ha Vu, 24 years old, who had been considering a religious vocation, was shot and died at the scene. Her brother, Kuong, 17 years old, an altar boy and high school football player who had spoken of wanting to become a priest, was also shot and died from his injuries. A third sibling, Chow Vu, survived by hiding inside a walk-in cooler. What followed the shooting is among the most audacious details of the entire case. Frank and Lacaze left. Then Frank came back, in her patrol car, in uniform, and approached the scene as though she were responding to the call. She spoke with Chow Vu, who had emerged from hiding, and asked what had happened. Chow recognized her immediately. When detectives arrived and began questioning witnesses, the account that emerged pointed directly at Frank. She was arrested that same night, and later gave a confession alongside Lacaze, which she subsequently recanted. Frank and Lacaze were indicted by an Orleans Parish grand jury on April 28, 1995. Their trials were separated. Lacaze was tried first in July of that year and was found guilty and sentenced to death. Frank's trial began on September 5, 1995. The jury returned a guilty verdict on all 3 counts of first-degree murder in 22 minutes, at that point a record for a capital case in New Orleans. The following day, after 45 minutes of deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty. On October 20, 1995, Judge Frank Marullo formally sentenced Antoinette Frank to death by lethal injection. 1 month after her sentencing, a dog led investigators to a human skull buried beneath the house Frank had previously shared with her father. The skull had a bullet hole through it. Frank had reported her father missing roughly 1.5 years before the murders at the Kim On. Authorities have never formally closed that case. Antoinette Frank has been on death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, Louisiana since 1995, the only woman on Louisiana's death row. In recent years, her legal team has argued that she acted under coercion from Lacaze, that her history of abuse was never properly presented to the jury, and that 2 jurors have since signed statements saying they would not have voted for death had they known the full picture. In 2019, Lacaze's death sentence was overturned through a deal with the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office. He now serves a life sentence. Frank remains on death row, still awaiting a resolution that has not come. Ronald Williams II, Ha Vu, and Kuong Vu do not have the option of waiting for anything.
Carlet Parker. She called it her calling. Caring for the elderly, sitting with the frail, being the steady and trusted presence in the room when someone's body had grown too weak to manage alone, Carlet Parker wore that identity like a second skin. She had the training, she had the credentials, and she had the kind of warm, accessible manner that made aging men and women feel at ease in her company. That was the gift, and it was also, in the most devastating way imaginable, the weapon. Because trust, when it is extended to the wrong person, does not protect you, it exposes you. Carlet Elizabeth Parker was born in 1964. By her 30s, she had carved out a working life in the healthcare world of central North Carolina, taking on roles that placed her directly in the homes and personal affairs of elderly clients. It was intimate work, the kind that required access to bank accounts, legal documents, and the daily routines of people who were no longer fully capable of managing those things themselves. And for a time, that access served the people who needed it most, until it did not. Before Alice Covington ever entered the picture, there were warning signs that the system around Carlet Parker had either missed or chosen to move past. In a prior case involving an elderly client, Parker had been found guilty of financial misconduct, exploiting the financial accounts of someone in her care. She was handed a suspended sentence, placed on probation, and ordered to make monthly restitution payments. She fell behind on those payments almost immediately, yet she continued working in elderly care. The revolving door kept turning, and on the other side of it stood people who had no idea who was coming through.
From December 1996 to March 1997, Parker provided care for an elderly man named Charles Holtz, who lived in a retirement community in the Raleigh area. Through Holtz, she became acquainted with his close friend and neighbor, Alice Covington. At the time, Alice was 86 years old, a small woman, standing 5 feet and 1 inch tall, weighing less than 90 pounds. She was sharp-minded but physically fragile, the kind of person for whom a helping hand was not a luxury but a genuine necessity. She could not have anticipated what that help would cost her. On the morning of May 12, 1998, Parker and Alice Covington crossed paths in the parking lot of a Kroger grocery store in Raleigh, sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock. What precisely was said between them, and whether Alice understood where she was being taken, has never been fully established. What is known is that witnesses later observed the two women together at another location, where a visible altercation occurred. No one stepped in. By the time the morning had progressed further, Parker had driven Alice to a Smithfield bank using Alice's own vehicle and withdrawn money from her account. The two then returned to the Kroger lot, transferred into Parker's Ford Fiesta, and headed to Parker's trailer in Angier, North Carolina. Alice Covington died in that trailer. She drowned in the bathtub. She was 86 years old and weighed less than 90 pounds, and the woman responsible for her death had spent years presenting herself to the world as a caregiver. What happened afterwards speaks to the kind of calculation that investigators and prosecutors found most disturbing. Parker did not panic. She did not flee. Instead, she methodically redressed Alice's body, put her in the back of the hatchback, drove to a family gathering that evening, and then, the following morning, drove back to the Kroger lot, moved Alice's body into Alice's own Mercury Sable, and drove that car to a dirt road in Morrisville, where she left it. On May 14, 1998, a passerby spotted the car and called police. Alice Covington was found inside. Investigators connected Parker to the case quickly. She had cashed a $2,500 check drawn from Alice's account the previous month. Bank records showed a pattern of withdrawals. Witnesses placed her with Alice on the day of her death. During police interviews, Parker grew visibly anxious when confronted with specific evidence, her legs shaking, her voice shifting, before settling into a denial that contradicted nearly everything investigators had already confirmed. The detail that perhaps said the most was something Parker muttered on the way home from one of those interviews. "I'm going to lose my job. I won't be able to take care of old people anymore." On March 30, 1999, the jury in Wake County found Carlet Parker guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping. 2 days later, they recommended the death penalty. The trial court entered judgment accordingly. Her conviction was affirmed by the North Carolina Supreme Court in 2001. Today, Carlet Parker is 59 years old and remains on death row at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. She is one of only 2 women on North Carolina's death row, a distinction she has held for more than 2 decades. North Carolina has not carried out an execution since 2006, as ongoing legal challenges to the state's capital punishment protocols have kept the process in suspension. Alice Covington trusted someone with her safety, her finances, and her daily life. She placed that trust in a trained professional whose job it was, by every definition of the role, to protect her. That trust was not just broken, it was used against her, deliberately and without hesitation, by the very person who carried the title of caregiver.
Erica Shephard. When we talk about the people who end up on death row, we almost always begin at the crime, the moment everything collapses. But Erica Shephard's story demands that we begin somewhere else. It demands that we begin with a 19-year-old mother of 3 who had already been failed by nearly every institution that should have helped her. A childhood home that was not safe, a relationship that became a source of ongoing harm, a police department that took her calls and did nothing, and a women's shelter that turned her away with nowhere to go. None of that explains June 30th, 1993, but if we are going to tell this story honestly, it has to be part of it. Erica Yvonne Shephard was born on September 1st, 1973, in Bay City, Texas, a small Gulf Coast city in Matagorda County.
She grew up in poverty, in a household marked by instability and harm. By the time she was a teenager, her world had already narrowed in ways that made every subsequent decision harder. She completed high school, a fact worth noting given everything stacked against her, and by the age of 19 had 3 young children. She had also been in a relationship with a man named Bryant who subjected her to prolonged physical abuse. She reported that abuse to the Houston Police Department in August of 1992. An officer came to her mother's house, noted what she said, and took no further action. She called the Bay City Police again in May of 1993 after an especially serious episode. She was directed to the Matagorda County Women's Crisis Center, which accepted her and her children, and then forced her to leave. 27 days later, Marilyn Sage Mager was dead. After being turned out of the shelter, Shephard went to stay with her older brother Jonathan in Houston. There, she encountered a man named James Dickerson, a friend of her brother's. Dickerson was also 19 years old. On June 30th, 1993, he and Shephard left the apartment complex together. Shephard had her infant daughter Audria with her. What the state of Texas and Shephard's own legal advocates have long disputed is exactly what happened next and how much of it was Shephard's choice versus Dickerson's direction. With the evidence established and what Shephard herself has acknowledged is that the two entered the apartment of Marilyn Sage Mager, 43 years old, a mother of 2 who had been unloading packages from her black Mazda and had left her front door unlocked. They went in and waited. When Mager returned and refused to give up her car keys, the situation turned irreversible. Mager sustained multiple stab wounds and blunt force injuries. Her daughter found her body under a pile of bedding in the spare bedroom. A dry cleaning bag had been placed over her head. Shephard's palm and fingerprints were found on the door leading to that room. Both Shephard and Dickerson were arrested. The trial began in February of 1995. The jury deliberated and found Shephard guilty of capital murder. On March 3, 1995, she was sentenced to death. James Dickerson received the same sentence. Shephard was 21 years old. She had no prior criminal record. What happened at that trial, and more precisely, what did not happen, became the central argument of the decades of appeals that followed. The attorney assigned to represent Shephard had never served as lead counsel in a capital case. He presented almost no mitigating evidence to the jury. The jury never heard about Shephard's childhood, the domestic abuse she had endured, the repeated failures of law enforcement and social services to protect her, and the mental health challenges she carried into that courtroom. Federal appellate judge Carolyn King would later write that Shephard's life history was so deeply marked by trauma and adversity that had the jury known it, the outcome of the penalty phase might have been different. That observation did not change the sentence. It stands in the record as an acknowledgement of what was missing and a quiet indictment of how little was done to put it there. For more than 3 decades, Shephard has remained on death row at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, making her the longest-serving woman on Texas's death row. The appeals have continued across multiple courts. In July of 2020, a split panel of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit upheld both her conviction and her sentence. In May of 2021, the United States Supreme Court declined to take up her case. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, responding to a petition filed by Cornell Law School on her behalf, issued a request for precautionary measures that same year, urging the United States not to set an execution date while her international human rights petition remained pending. As of 2025, Shephard was among 11 people, and the only woman, held on death row in Harris County for 30 years or more. Marilyn Sage Mager's daughters have carried the weight of that June night for over 30 years. Her mother was 43 years old, and she died because 2 teenagers wanted her car. That fact does not become anything less true because of anything that preceded it. Neither does the fact that the legal proceedings that sent Erica Shephard to death row were deeply flawed. Both things exist inside this case at the same time, pulling against each other through 30-plus years of court filings, denied appeals, and a death sentence that has not yet been carried out, but has not been lifted either.
Christy Michelle Scott. Fire is often described as a living thing, a hungry entity that devours whatever it touches with an insatiable appetite. In the quiet hours of a late summer night in Alabama, the air is usually thick with the scent of pine and the hum of cicadas, a natural lullaby for the sleeping world. It is a time when families are tucked away in the perceived safety of their rooms, believing the walls around them are a shield against any external threat. But what if the very person meant to watch over the hearth is the one who invites the flame to consume the sanctuary? What if the warmth of a maternal embrace is replaced by the searing heat of a blaze that was never intended to be extinguished? This is not just a story of a structure lost to the elements, but a story of a profound internal choice that would forever change the landscape of a small community. How does a place of rest become a terrain of such profound transformation? Christy Michelle Scott lived a life that many in Russellville, Alabama would have recognized as common and unremarkable. At 30 years old, she was a woman navigating the complexities of raising two young boys in a modest home. Her husband, Jeremy, was often away for long periods, working to provide for the family, leaving Christy to manage the daily rhythms of their lives. Among her children was Mason, a 6-year-old boy who moved through the world with a different tempo than his peers. Diagnosed with various developmental challenges, including autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, Mason required a level of patience and care that tested the limits of those around him. In the eyes of the neighborhood, Christy was the primary guardian of his safety, the one person whose presence should have been an absolute guarantee of his well-being. But in the deep silence of the night, a different narrative was beginning to take shape, one that would soon emerge from the ashes of their Senior Drive residence. What is the true measure of a person's devotion when the weight of their circumstances begins to press down with an unyielding force? Can the human heart truly prioritize a digital balance in a bank account over the steady heartbeat of its own offspring? These are the questions that linger in the minds of those who look back at the events of the 16th of August, 2008. On that evening, the world seemed still, yet a series of actions were being set into motion that would defy every natural instinct of protection. As the clock moved toward the early morning hours, a fire began to take hold in the children's room, a flickering orange light that grew into a roar. While Christy and her younger son found a way out through a window, Mason was left behind as the environment became increasingly hostile to the breath of life. The escape was not a silent one, yet it carried an air of detachment that would later be scrutinized. Christy appeared at her neighbor's door, urgent and distressed, reporting that her home was being consumed. Jennifer Davidson, the neighbor, was met with a scene of immense urgency. As the emergency calls were placed at 2:33 and 2:35 in the morning, the severity of the situation became clear to the responding units. But even in the midst of the emergency, observers noted peculiar details. Christy seemed remarkably composed about her own safety, declining medical attention and appearing fully dressed in the aftermath. When her father arrived at the scene, his words cut through the night, asking what had been done. It was a question born of a long memory, a reference to a history of similar incidents that had followed Christy like a shadow for several years. This was not the first time Christy Michelle Scott had stood before a smoldering ruin and watched the smoke rise into the Alabama sky. In January 2006, her previous home had been leveled by a similar event. While she had received a significant payout from that incident, no formal accusations had been made at that time. However, the authorities in Russellville were now looking at the current situation with a much more critical eye. They began to piece together a timeline that was as revealing as it was unsettling. Just 12 hours before the fire broke out, Christy had finalized a new life indemnity policy for Mason, valued at $100,000. This document, intended to provide security in the face of loss, appeared to many to be a catalyst rather than a safety net for the family's future. As the officials sifted through the remains of the house, they found evidence that spoke of a deliberate intent. A smoke detector, an essential tool for the preservation of life, was found on the floor, completely untouched by the heat. It had been pulled from the wall before the blaze could reach it, its silence a testament to a plan that required the inhabitants to remain unaware of the growing danger. Furthermore, personal items that were precious to Christy, photographs, important documents, and jewelry, had been moved to a safe location before the first spark was ever lit. It was a pattern of behavior that suggested a preparation for loss, a clearing of the path for a new beginning funded by the very tragedy she claimed was an accident. The officials also discovered that a substance had been administered to Mason to ensure he would remain in a deep sleep as the fire spread, preventing him from seeking the very exit his mother and brother had utilized.
The legal proceedings began in 2009, and the courtroom became a stage for a deep exploration of Christy's character and the nature of her choices. The prosecution presented a case that focused on the intersection of financial struggle and a mother's perceived burden. They argued that the developmental needs of Mason had become a weight Christy no longer wished to carry, and that she saw a path to freedom through the collection of the indemnity funds. Witnesses testified about her strange reactions on the night of the fire, including her concern that a specific fire official might be the one to lead the inquiry. They also presented evidence that the fire had been started in multiple locations, ensuring that it would be effective in its purpose. The testimony of over 70 individuals painted a picture of a woman whose actions were inconsistent with the grief expected of a grieving parent. Is it possible for the mind to justify such an act as a form of release from the pressures of a difficult life? Or is it simply a manifestation of a profound lack of empathy, a detachment from the reality of another's existence? The jury listened to weeks of testimony, weighing the life of a young boy against the actions of the woman who brought him into the world. In July 2009, they returned with a verdict that acknowledged the weight of the evidence and the gravity of the crimes. However, when it came to the matter of the final judgment, the jury recommended a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. They chose a path that would keep Christy confined but would not take her life, perhaps reflecting a collective hesitation to deliver the absolute judicial consequence. But the legal system in Alabama at the time allowed for a different outcome. Judge Terry Dempsey, after reviewing the details of the case, decided to exercise a power known as a judicial override. He believed that the nature of the crime, a mother ending the life of her child for the purpose of acquiring monetary assets, required the most absolute form of punishment. In August 2009, he delivered a sentence that placed Christy Michelle Scott on the row of the condemned at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. It was a decision that sparked immense debate across the state, highlighting the tension between the collective voice of a jury and the singular authority of a judge in matters of life and death. Today, Christy remains behind the walls of that facility, one of the few women in the state awaiting the finality of her sentence. Her presence there is a quiet testament to a story of profound loss and the dark corners of the human psyche. We are left to reflect on the meaning of home and the sacred nature of the bond between a parent and a child. How do we protect the most fragile among us when the threat comes from the very source of their comfort? The story of Christy Michelle Scott and her son Mason serves as a somber marker in the history of American justice, a reminder that the truth often has a way of emerging from even the most intense flames, leaving behind a legacy of questions that may never be fully answered. It forces us to confront the reality that the greatest dangers are not always found in the outside world, but can sometimes reside within the very hearts of those we are taught to trust the most. As time moves forward, the silence of the Senior Drive residence remains a haunting echo of a night when a mother's duty was traded for the promise of a different future, written in smoke and ash.
Rebecca, Auburn. The city of Columbus, Ohio, often presents itself as a tapestry of Midwestern industry and quiet suburban streets, where the rhythms of daily life hum with a predictable and steady pulse. Within this urban landscape, thousands of paths cross every hour, creating a complex web of encounters that define the shared human experience. Most of these meetings are brief, forgotten as quickly as they occur, but there is a profound mystery in the anonymity of the crowd. Can we ever truly understand the internal world of the individual walking toward us on a sidewalk or sitting in the car idling at a red light? What drives a person to cross the line between existence and the destruction of another? To the casual observer, the northeast quadrant of the city was merely a place of transition, a corridor of highways and businesses. However, in the shadows of the late hours, a different kind of story was being written, one that would eventually prompt the community to question the very nature of trust and the hidden costs of human desire. To the outside world, Rebecca Auburn appeared to be navigating the difficult terrain of a life lived on the fringes of society. At 33 years old, she was a woman whose presence was woven into the fabric of a specific neighborhood, moving through the area around Interstate 71 and Cleveland Avenue. She existed in a world where transactions were often silent and survival was a daily negotiation. But beneath this surface of common struggle, there was a series of choices being made that would forever alter the lives of multiple families. What happens when the pursuit of material gain becomes so detached from the value of human life that the two are no longer seen as separate? What leads a soul to decide that the belongings of a stranger are worth more than the stranger's right to continue their journey on this earth? These are the heavy questions that began to surface as the local authorities started to notice a disturbing pattern emerging from the quiet corners of the city. The investigation into these events did not begin with a loud alarm, but rather with a series of tragic discoveries that seemed at first to be isolated incidents of a modern crisis. However, the Central Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force began to see a thread connecting these disparate moments of sorrow. They received information regarding a woman who was meeting men for the purpose of a private exchange, only for that encounter to end in a permanent silence for the male participant. It was a pattern of interaction that was as old as the city itself, yet it was being utilized as a cover for a much darker intent. Rebecca Auburn was not merely seeking to navigate the world of solicitation, she was allegedly utilizing the intimacy of those moments to introduce a lethal substance into the systems of her companions. The timeline of these events is a somber map of lost opportunities and stolen futures. It began in December 2022, on the 13th day of that month, with an encounter that left a man in a state of deep distress, though he managed to survive the ordeal. This initial incident might have been seen as a warning, a glimpse into an escalating darkness that was yet to fully manifest, but the pattern continued, and the stakes became absolute. On January 15, 2023, the first of 4 men would experience his final moments after meeting with Rebecca. The year progressed, and with it, the frequency of these occurrences increased. On April 1, 2023, another life was extinguished, followed closely by a third on April 13th of the same year. By the time the 17th of June 2023 arrived, a 4th man had met his end in the exact same manner. Each of these men had walked into a meeting expecting one thing, only to be met with the theft of their possessions and their very breath. The details of these encounters are difficult to reconcile with the image of a woman simply trying to survive. Rebecca would later admit to supplying the substance that caused the passing of at least one of these individuals, and she acknowledged that she took advantage of their incapacitated state to take what did not belong to her. This admission reveals a profound disconnect from the sanctity of the human form. Is it possible for a person to become so hardened by their own circumstances that the life of another becomes nothing more than an obstacle to be managed? The authorities worked with a quiet intensity, piecing together the movements of the woman who had turned the streets of northeast Columbus into a terrain of hidden danger. They focused on the specific geographic boundaries of State Route 161 and East 17th Avenue, searching for the evidence that would finally bring this sequence of tragedies to a halt. In September 2023, the trajectory of Rebecca's life shifted from the shadows of the street to the stark light of the legal system. She was arrested on the 11th of that month, and by October 25, 2023, a grand jury had handed down an indictment that listed the weight of her actions. The charges were numerous, reflecting the sheer volume of the incidents she was accused of overseeing. While she initially maintained a posture of non-guilt, the reality of the investigation eventually led to a different conclusion. On December 19, 2025, Rebecca Auburn stood before the court and entered a plea of guilty to 4 counts of murder and 1 count of felonious assault.
It was a moment of profound gravity, a formal acknowledgement of the destruction she had wrought upon the community and the families who were left to piece together the remains of their lives. As Rebecca Burns begins her life within the confines of the state's correctional system, the city of Columbus continues its steady hum. The streets where these events occurred remain, but they are now haunted by the memory of those who were lost. This case serves as a somber reminder of the fragility of the human connection and the darkness that can hide behind a common facade. It forces us to look closer at the world around us and to recognize that the most profound dangers are often those that hide in plain sight, masked by the anonymity of the crowd and the complexities of the human heart. Rebecca's story is now a permanent part of the American legal system, a testament to the fact that even in the busiest corners of our cities, the search for truth and the demand for justice will eventually find their way to those who believe they can operate in the shadows. We are left to wonder, how many other stories are currently being written in the quiet hours of the night, and will we ever truly be able to prevent the next shadow from falling?